Hey everybody, it's John. Welcome back to Stand By for Adventure. This week I wanted to talk about story structure, and specifically story structure in role-playing games. And I figured out in the last couple of weeks kind of how I think about stories over, well, the years of running games. And um, I think there's about 6 or 7 categories. I came up with 6, and then a friend of mine added a 7th that I think is distinctive, and so I included it. So thank you, Kevin. And that's what we're going to talk about. And when I talk about story structure, what I really mean is how you, as the GM, think of the game, think of the entire game. Whether it's a single session and you never play again, or if it's a years-long running campaign that is super involved and personalized to your player characters and lasts forever, and the differences that you can experience as a GM, and a good way, and this is also a good way for you to think of things in your head so that it remains consistent to the players, so that you're not suddenly changing the entire feel of the game. This will make more sense as we dive into each of these categories. But let's just do that. I'm just going to get started. So RPGs and story structure. Whoops. So the first option that I came up with, and yes, this is slide 2. I did not skip over one. Well, I did, and then I came back. And the idea behind this is the very simplest of setups for a campaign or a series of games or even a one-shot. And it's basically what people might consider story-driven, as opposed to character-driven, and that's kind of the two ends of this scale. I'm starting with story-driven, and what I mean by that is, and I think what people generally mean by that is, there is a story that will happen, and your characters are involved in that story. Your characters' motivations, their personalities, their backstories, the things that make them interesting, if they have anything, don't matter at all, other than how it affects the way you play your character as a player. These are the sorts of games that a lot of people start with, or back in the day started with, because it was very encounter-based, very module-based, pre-written adventure-based, and people would just run, all right, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, and then here's the denouement, the climax, end of the story and the adventure, and then it's over. The players, or the characters, don't influence that story other than how they are involved in it. And they are only involved basically to do some investigation, kill some people who did bad things, recover items that were stolen, but they have no connection to them necessarily, no connection to what was stolen, no connection to the people who were killed. They could be adventurers, freelancers who are brought in to take care of a problem. That is the simplest version of what a role-playing game can be, and it is a perfectly fine way to play a game. Some people run this sort of game their entire lives, because what they want to really do is hang out with their friends and play a game that's fun and tactical, and you get to think, and there's traps and puzzles, and there's combat, and that's what matters. That's what matters to that player. And then as we sort of move through the different steps of this, or the different types, I shouldn't even say steps, and I won't say rungs, because one is not better than the other. They're all just different. It's just a different approach. But this is a perfectly fine way to run a game, and this would be along the lines of, Ghost of Saltmarsh. If you just ran this as, your characters are in Saltmarsh, You can come up with a reason why you're here, and they hear about a haunted house up on a hill. What do you want to do? And you can tell that whole story out of this book. The players don't have to really interact with anybody in a meaningful way. You could run it kind of as a board game. If they want to have a shopping spree, you might just say, yeah, go through the book, spend the money that you want to spend, and tell me what you buy. And if there's anything weird on there, maybe we'll have to have a discussion. But we don't need to role play through your interactions with the guy at the general store. Really, the game is about the adventure, and that's about it. You could also introduce more personal things into this game, but that's up to you. And in fact, that would then move you on to the next type of story structure, which is the campaign that's apparently how I say that now. The campaign is centered on a story or adventure with a little deviation, and that deviation is basically to give the player characters some small side stories or events that happen that are generated by them, that they end up doing. So, for instance, if you're running Saltmarsh, one of the things in there, and this actually came up in my campaign, one of the things in that adventure was the job board outside Hool Watch Tower, which is like the guard tower in Saltmarsh. And there was a job listing straight out of the book that I said was there that said there were some people who had gone missing on a road nearby, and they, I think the book says it has something to do with bandits or slavers or something, and so I just had to wing that side story because the players decided that they were going to go pursue that. And I wasn't going to tell them no, so great. There wasn't a pre-written thing in the book for what this side adventure was going to be. It earned them a little more money. It gave me 2 extra sessions out of a game to run that I hadn't expected, but it didn't overall affect the entire story because that's completely unrelated to what the Saltmarsh adventure is about, or at least it is so far in the book, and maybe I'll come back to that at some point and it'll circle back in somehow, because obviously in Saltmarsh you're dealing with, spoilers, so if you don't know anything about Saltmarsh, don't continue listening, but that setting has to do with, or that adventure has to do with, in the initial stages, smugglers. And so bandits and smugglers, really the only difference is smugglers, in this case, are on the water, and the bandits do the same sort of thing. Maybe they're kidnapping people, maybe they're stealing from them, whatever, but it's not necessarily related. And that's what I mean by there is a story that is going to move forward, the characters are going to be involved in that, and then maybe they have little things they do off to the sides, whether it's a side quest or a personal thing that they want to do, or they decide to rip off the wizard that lives in the tower because they think there might be some cool magical stuff in there. Great, they can do that. If that makes sense to them and they want to do that, there you go. It doesn't have a huge effect on the overall story of what is written in that book. That is a second option for how you can run your campaigns. And you can see the differences, right? In one case, you're running straight, beginning to end, straight out of the book, no real deviation. You don't expect the players to go off in some random direction. And if they do, it probably is connected back to the story in some way, or at least that's probably how you want to run it, because you don't want to go off in all sorts of random directions. This second one allows for a little more randomization and a little more customization, but it's still pretty much the adventure as written, and you just go from there. It's a very, very easy way of running games. This is why there are modules and adventures that companies publish. This is why there have always been adventure modules in role-playing games. This is why Wizards of the Coast is now producing these big, slick books that have an entire campaign in a single book, and why Paizo releases their adventure paths, which are a bunch of, I think they're typically 6 parts, but I think they've also been doing some shorter ones. But adventures that are take you through an entire campaign, 10 to 20 levels worth of adventure. And it saves you from having to come up with everything, but it does also limit some of what is possible in the story because it's not just freeform being created at the table completely out of whole cloth. And as we get further and further down, we will get more and more stories that are out of whole cloth. So this is option 2. Option 3 is there's an overarching story, so maybe an adventure, but this could also be something that you as the GM have come up with. Oh, come on, kitten. That you as the GM have come up with, and you know that there's something going on, like dragons are trying to take over the world. That's the overarching plot, and everything that you do as the GM, depending on what the players do, they could get involved in that plot line, or they might decide, I'm not going to mess with dragons. Or maybe in the beginning they decide they're not going to mess with dragons, but then the campaign, they end up getting powerful enough and kind of getting sucked into some things, and then they are going to end up dealing with these dragons that are trying to take over the world. But you don't know that from the start. In pre-written adventures, you know what the ending is going to be. It's going to end when you get to X point, and the only variation is how X resolves, right? When you're talking about something like this, you might be running Saltmarsh out of the book, and you decide to come up with a time schedule for how things progress unless the PCs do something. So again, in Saltmarsh, maybe if the player characters get involved and go fix the haunted house and tackle that particular challenge, but then they get distracted by some other character. Maybe one of the player characters has a side quest. A family member shows up and asks for their help. They can choose to either continue to pursue what's going on with Saltmarsh or go help their friend or family member, whoever it is that needs help. And if they follow the plot line that isn't specifically tied to Saltmarsh, you as GM know what is going to happen and know that there is going to be trouble with the lizard men and with whatever else is down the line in that series of adventures that could have a huge effect on the world, but the players have just decided not to go in that direction, and that is perfectly fine if that is the sort of story that you are interested in telling and able to tell. And it may also end up that the players come back and start to tangle with / tackle the war with the lizard man plot line or whatever it turns into, right? I'm just using that as an example. But this is the third sort of option where you do have an overarching story and your players are involved, maybe if they decide to be, but there's still going to be consequences on the world whether they get involved or not, and that may eventually influence them and get them involved because they see that things are happening that they might be able to do something about. It's sort of an interesting way of setting up a world, and you could do it in a campaign. You could do it in a way that feels really weird to the players. For instance, start the game where there is an undead plague of zombies and skeletons overrunning the nation or a big section of the world, and the player characters might decide not to engage in that at all, other than to deal with these zombies and skeletons when they're traveling around and have to make sure they're safe and not going to get eaten in the middle of the night. But they're not looking to solve that problem, at least not initially. And it can be really kind of interesting because eventually maybe they will pick up some clues and that will tie back into the story. So again, this is a little more story out of whole cloth, not so much pre-written, but there are consequences for not dealing with what you have planned and scheduled at certain points of time during the course of the campaign. This was the one introduced by my friend Kevin, and I think it stands on its own as a separate type of structure. I was thinking this would be looped into something else, but I think it is different. So in this case, and this is very similar to how Matt Mercer runs things on Critical Role, and his first campaign kind of was the story structure before this, because he had the dragons who were trying to take over the world, but the players did all sorts of other stuff before they eventually came back to dealing with those dragons and taking care of it. In the second campaign, that story was a little more like this, and what this is the player characters are the story. Every plot hook comes from them. Every idea will eventually link back to them in some way. The game revolves around their backstories. There are flashbacks that reveal character information, possibly not required, or there are things that you might run, little vignettes that reveal certain events and show why certain things are pivotal to the PCs and why they are central to the story. So, again, using Campaign 2 of Critical Role as an example, this would be things like Caleb dealing with the Cerberus Assembly and everything that goes on there. It was the absolute central thing for that character, right? He had been taken advantage of by them, horribly abused by them, and was able to escape. And his whole story was, I want to get powerful enough to take the fight back to these people who I know are doing wrong. And that's what he spent the entire campaign doing. Other characters came in and out of that at certain times. Not slash Veth certainly helped with that and helped to wanted him to become more powerful for Veth for her own reasons, so she could eventually return to normal. But it served Caleb's ultimate purpose of dealing with his former mentor and torturer. And that's the idea for this sort of story. It's very much centered on the PCs and what they have going on. Ford in the second campaign, also a perfect example. He had all that stuff with Uk'otoa. They basically wrapped up the Uk'otoa plotline. He figured out another way to go about being a player character, and it made for a super interesting game. And a super interesting character. By the end, I think Ford is probably one of the more interesting characters in that group, full of interesting characters. But this is sort of the middle, and this is a pretty complicated way of running things, because you have to have players who have ideas for their characters that give you ideas as the GM, and then you have to come up with everything in the campaign. There's nothing pre-written unless you are cribbing things out of adventures that already exist. I do this frequently. I think most people do this very often when running games. They see an adventure and they go, or even a map or something like that, and they go, oh, okay, I can modify this a little bit to have whatever the end treasure is be the thing the characters are looking for. Even if the module doesn't mention that thing, I can just put it in there because it doesn't have to be exactly what the module says. It can be what I want it to be. That's a great way to come up with encounters and things too. So, again, this is a pretty complicated way of running a game. I think this is the dream for everybody, is to have it feel like their characters are, if not the one, they are all central to the stories that you are telling over the course of your campaign, and that is why you are playing the game, and that is why the player characters matter. And there you go. The most important people in the world are not other people; they are the player characters in this case. The fourth type of story structure. Is that right? Fifth is there is an overarching story, and the PCs are central to it and intimately tied to it. Uh, and examples of this include stories. Did I skip one? Hold on. PCs are the story. They don't matter. Campaign is centered. Yes, there's an overarching story. Yep, okay. So this is sort of the next step when I mentioned in the last slide about stories about the one, like Neo, right? Or even something like Lord of the Rings, where you have kind of Frodo or Bilbo, whichever story you want to be talking about, who is the main character in terms of he is the person who is carrying the object that everybody has to protect to get to the end. Another example of this would be something like, was it not the Name of the Wind? Well, the Name of the Wind is also a really good example with Kvothe. He is also very much the one, right? Like, he is the hero of the setting. And so these stories are focused kind of on a specific thing or the group of characters because they are centrally important, and the story reflects that as they also, in turn, reflect the story. This might be a group of characters who, if you wanted to do a really simple thing like, all of the characters have returned from the dead for some reason. They have no idea why. They need to figure out why. And they are the reason for the entire campaign to find out what is going on, why they've come back. Do they have some role to play? Is this a curse? Is it a blessing? Is it something else entirely? Are they actually reincarnated gods? Are they... So there could be anything, right? And it has to do specifically with those players. They are at the center of it, and they will always be at the center of it because there's no other way to tell that story. The next option. This is more heading into kind of a sandbox feel, and when I say that, it's a term that's used in game design, probably familiar to everybody, where, and especially in computer games, so if you think of something like Elder Scrolls, you've got this huge universe of stuff you can investigate and talk to people and find plot lines and find stories and uncover curses and uncover plots, and you might decide to pursue one that has to do with corruption in the city guard, or you might decide to learn how to be a better fisherman, or so there's any number of things in the world that you could stumble upon at any time, but there's not a specific story that the GM or you as the player are necessarily headed towards. Let me just read through this slide. So there are mysteries in the world, but it's up to the PCs to decide whatever story that appeals to them, whichever story appeals to them, and or if they happen to stumble across it. So they can either pursue it on their own if they see something that interests them, or they stumble across something and suddenly they're involved in something like somebody's murdered in front of them and hands them a dagger that looks really unique, but they don't know anything else. So then maybe they do something with that, maybe not. And this could be a long story. It could be a bunch of long stories that are one after the other after the other. They could be a bunch of either interconnected stories or completely unconnected. And this would sort of fit for games in which players might come to the table. Oh, think for instance, if you and your friends have like a big gaming club, or you're in a high school or something and there's a gaming club. But for me, it was in college. We had a big gaming club, and we had what we called an open world D&D game, and it was just not particularly defined, and you could take a character from one game to another, and it didn't matter because all the person running the game had to say was, bring a character who's between 4th and 6th level, and I'm going to run a D&D game. And it was whatever that encounter or series of adventures were, that's what we played through. And whether that was Tomb of Horrors or something else, the stories weren't necessarily connected to one another, but they were connected by the players and the characters that went through those stories. Even if it ultimately didn't end up making a whole heck of a lot of sense, it's still a fun way to play a game. And you can run a campaign like this where, and this was also pretty common back in the 80s and 90s, where you would pick up an adventure and you would run that adventure, and then when it concluded, you would just pick up another adventure and run that adventure. And even if those two adventures weren't connected in any way. And it's a way to tell a story. That's a way to do it, and that's why I'm putting it in here. So, could be connected, could not. It's a big sandbox world. The players will eventually find something, or the characters will eventually find something that interests them, and they will pursue it, and that's the game. This is the last slide. And in this case, the entire world is a sandbox. There could be no overarching storyline at all that matters. It's just a big fantasy world, like, say, the Forgotten Realms in its pre-written form that just sets up the entire world. There are things you can go find, and then whatever the players happen to get involved with or stumble into becomes the story. The PCs may be known as great heroes, or they may not. That depends on the sorts of adventures that they have. If you set up the campaign so that they end up being great heroes, then fantastic. That's what ends up happening. But they could remain complete unknowns for the entire campaign because there's no huge storyline that brings them to the attention necessarily of, the kings and queens and leaders of nations and things like that. And instead it's just a game of what the player characters wanted to do and how the players wanted to play the game. So if you think about those 7 different ways of running games, I think that's kind of a useful way to break things down and to think of them as you are coming up with a campaign or as you are in the midst of running your game. Because with role-playing games, if you're lucky and you get to play once a week, when I was in high school, it was every single day. So that was fun. But if you get to play once a week, any of these campaign structures could last you for well over a year, over 2 years, over many, many years. Or it could be a couple of sessions, whatever you wanted to do. But I think it's useful to think about it in these ways because setting up these story structures like this also gives you as the GM different bells and whistles that you can adjust, or knobs and dials is kind of how people refer to it. So that you can change certain aspects of the story and the setup of the campaign and still be able to tell a successful long-running story if that's what you're interested in doing. But you can also run short games or short campaigns and have them also be successful because you have different expectations for what you're going to be doing. I hope this is useful to you. If you are curious or have questions or want to know more, please leave me some questions and I will try to answer them. If this isn't clear to you, I'm also interested in hearing that because maybe I can come up with some better examples of things and do another maybe deeper dive into each one of these options if people seem interested in that, or expand on a few of them. So just let me know if there's anything that I can help. I'm happy to do it. And like I said, I think this is a good way to think about the different ways to structure a story for role-playing games. And it's always useful to be thinking of things like this as a GM. And like I said, it's taken me a long time to figure out, like, oh yeah, there are all these different ways of running games. And if I can kind of give you a shortcut into realizing that early on, it's going to make running games so much easier for you. And I think this will probably make it more fun to run it's because you have a framework in which to think of everything. So that's it for today. Stand by for adventure. Please like, subscribe, and share. Would appreciate it if you would share the videos or let people know who you think might be interested. Thank you very much. Have a good night.